And now let's welcome Beatriz Guijarro from the Spanish Institute of Oceanography, who will be talking about asymmetric impacts under European management policies, fisheries sustainability and habitat conservation in the Western Mediterranean, Balearic Islands.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity of being here today to show some of the studies that we are doing. And I wanted to start this talk talking about some FAO data that we have. They have established that more than 40% of the world population cannot afford a healthy diet. In this context, aquatic ecosystems are increasingly recognized as vital for food and nutrition security. In fact, more than 220 million tons are produced from the fisheries and aquaculture. And it is key in this context to maximize the opportunity that ecosystem or aquatic ecosystem in general present. This also can support the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The world production of fisheries and aquaculture is not evenly distributed. In fact, around 70% of the productions comes from Asian region. However, if we look at the map of the bottom, in which we can see the consumption per capita by region, we can see that there are several regions with very large quantities of consumption, not only Asia, but also Europe, North America, and Oceania. What that means is that a lot of trading is carried out worldwide. In fact, if we look to Europe, up to 35% of the aquatic production comes from areas outside the European region. And if we see, I think you cannot see the part of the graph here, but if we look at the top exporters and importers, among the top 5, we have 2 European countries. The fourth one, you should believe me, but you cannot see here, is Spain. Oh, it's okay, it is fine, I think. That's enough just to know that Spain is the fourth country in imports, and another European country, in this case France, is the 5th one. Sorry, I jumped one. So if we look on a smaller scale, in this case, the Mediterranean and Black Sea, imports and export, that is trading, is also very important. And again, we have, in this case, we have Spain and the most important trader, both in imports and exports. But group classification, what we can see is that the lower middle income countries, these are mostly the ones in the north of Africa, export approximately 45% of all the trading balance that they have. On the contrary, the high income countries, mainly the EU countries, import up to 43% of all this trading. The stock exploitation of the fisheries stocks in the Mediterranean have experienced an improvement in the last 10 years. In 2013, near 90% of the stocks assessed were sustainable over sustainable level. But this value has decreased up to 52% by 2023. That has been linked to an important decrease of fishing mortality of up to 50%, and has been linked also with the increase of the biomass at sea, which in this year had increased up to 25%. This is the biomass at sea. That is the quantity of animals that we can find in the environment. One of the most environmental damaging fishing practice is bottom trawling. In fact, there is an increasing opposition to this type of gear because it has a high impact in the seafloor, but also in the species and in the habitats. It has also a high discard rate, and the greenhouse emissions, it's really high as well due to fuel consumption and also by the release of the stored carbon from the seabed sediments. The magnitude of these discards is something that is still subject to discussion. However, this gear is still demonized, it's very restricted and even banned in many areas. But we need to take into account that trawling accounts for 25% of the global marine fishing catches. And in fact, it provides a lot of millions of people food, both food and employment. And it's true that there are alternative gears than fishing, but it's also true that many benthic demersal species will not be able to be caught with a different gear except on trolling. Something that we need to consider is that fishing and also bottom trolling is one of the different forms of food production that we have worldwide, and that we can compare it to different other types of productions. In this sense, as an average, trolling is among the less efficient gear types. You cannot see the numbers here, but there are only 2 types of productions which are in higher fuel consumption than the average bottom troll fishery, which is the farmed salmon and the beef, which are 2 types of products that are usually found in the markets. But it's also true that some of the troll fisheries are already very efficient. I mean, their efficiency is even better than most of all of the meat production that we have worldwide. One example is the Alaskan bottom troll fishery. Trolling, as I mentioned, is very regulated, and in fact is the most regulated fisheries in European waters. And the objective of that was correcting the historical overfishing situation that we have in the area, and also minimize the strong impact it has to the environment. Currently in Spain, there are many management measures in force, and among them we can mention the deep limits, the prohibition of fishing in certain habitats, and other important ones, like for instance, the fishing effort regime, which is that the number of fishing days that a boat can perform during the year is limited. Also, very recently, we have started having catch limits for certain demersal species, which is also that usually happen in other fisheries in worldwide, but in the Mediterranean, in the demersal fishery, is something very new. The bottom troll fleet operating in Spain has its port base in 3 different geographical subareas: 2 in the mainland, the northern Arbolan Sea and the northern Spain, and the third one is the SA5, which is the Balearic Islands. In all these areas, bottom troll represent 20% of the number of vessels of all the fleet, being the most abundant ones, the artisanal fleet with more than 60%. Something that has happened in the last year is that there can be a sharp decrease in the number of trawlers in the Spanish Mediterranean coast. It has decreased up to 40%. But also it's relevant that the distribution of this vessel is uneven among the different areas. In fact, in the case of the Balearic Islands, here they only represent 6% of the total number of vessels in the Spanish Mediterranean. In the graph on the right, you cannot see it, but what we wanted to show here is that it's not only the absolute number of vessels, it's also the relative importance. If we look how many vessels we have by a square kilometer, the numbers in the Balearic Islands is 4 times smaller than in the nearby peninsula. So for all this, we can see that, well, and we will see things about that later on, the Balearic Islands are in a better conservation status than the Iberian nearby peninsula. We already mentioned that in the Spanish waters, the number of bottom trawlers has decreased a lot. And this is something that we also see here in the Balearic Islands. For instance, we did a prediction about the number of trawlers in Mallorca, and we predicted that by 2038, they will disappear because the trend is clearly decreasing and linear. That means that this can have problems in the long-term viability, not on the bottom troll only itself, but also on the entire fisheries in the Balearic Islands. This fleet is very important because it gives supplies of seasonal and locally sourced seafood, and also is very relevant to the heritage and or coastal livelihood. However, the fleet here is facing different problems. The management measures that I apply are equivalent in all the Spanish waters, without taking into account the difference that we can have between regions in exploitation and also in the state of the conservation of the resources. That means that there can be also exploitation asymmetries even inside the Spanish waters, and that means also that the availability of local sustainably exploited products is decreasing. And in fact, currently it represents around 10%. That means that up to 90% of the marine production from sea that is consumed in the Balearic Islands comes from somewhere else. Sometimes these imports can come to countries in which the regulations are not as strong as this, and we cannot know the state of conservation of the resources. So that means that we are displacing the environmental pressure abroad, and that may imply global inequalities. So the question here is, can bottom trawling and environmental conservation coexist in the Balearic Islands? Looking to some of the data we have, here you can see different maps resulting for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive in the case of the Levantine Balearic demarcation, which corresponds to part of the mainland and the Balearic Islands. So if we analyze different indicators, if we look at the bottom trawl intensity, we can see that in the island, the values are much lower in all the areas all around the islands in comparison to the mainland. Also, if we look at the proportion of sentinel species, which are those that have been selected as reflecting a good conservation status, what we can see, the darker blue means that the proportion of these sentinel species is very high. So again, we can see the situation in the island very different from the mainland. And also, if we take into account the disturbance level of the different habitats, what we can see is the greens represent that the habitats are not disturbed by the fishing fleet. And again, we see the extension of this much higher in the Balearic Island than in the mainland. So if we take a look to the state of exploitation of the demersal resources, these are different stock assessment validated by the GFCM. We can see that for most of the demersal stocks assessed in the Balearic Islands, the situation is currently sustainably exploited. That means that the current levels of fishing mortality are below the target ones. So that is very positive. But it also means that in most of the cases, the biomass are showing increasing trends, and that they're even over the target reference points, which is quite positive. No, I would say very positive in this case. But we can see what happened to other types of species, for instance, sharks and rays. Sharks and rays are considered vulnerable species because of their own characteristics. They have a very low fecundity, they have a very low growth. And all these characteristics that imply that their level of vulnerability to the pressures is higher than in other species. So analyzing a time series of 20 years for 19 sharks and rays on the Balearic Islands, what we detect is that in many cases there was not a clear trend, so there was certain stability, but for some indicators, in this case, for instance, the distribution area and the abundance, there has been increasing trends. And in fact, for most of them, they have achieved a good environmental status. If we look to the most threatened species, which are the ones that you can see in the bottom, the situation is very similar. I mean, there is a strong stability of the lasmogram population in the Balearic Islands, and even clear signals of recovery for a part of them. The question here now is that we don't know if this recovery will go on, or we are already in a stable situation, or what is going to happen in the future. But the trend is clear. But we can also look at the vulnerable benthic habitats and species. This is an example in the Menorca Channel. The Menorca Channel is a site of community importance that since 2016, there is a large part, you can see in the map, the blue part is a fishing protected zone. So bottom trawling is forbidden there. We compare the abundance, about the average abundance before after the implementation of the closed zone for the rhodolites and mile beds, which has this calcareous red algae that you can see in the video, and also for the kelp forest, with are the leaves of brown algae that you can see also in the video. So the average biomass significantly increased for both type of species and habitats, around 40% for the rhodolites and more than around 150% for the kelp forest. But also, in addition to this, the surface it covered has increased 6% for rhodolites and more than 50% for the kelp forest, which means that these habitats are extending to wider areas. And what is also relevant here is that we have detected that this increase in the surface is not only in the closure area. It has also been detected in areas in which they are still open to troll fishing. So that makes us think that both types of things, the activity of trolling and the conservation of these habitats, can be compatible. Another look to a bit more about what's happening with the bottom troll fleet landings of the Balearic Island, in concrete of Mallorca. We are having this trend of a clear decrease in the effort. In the case of Mallorca, the number of vessels have decreased from 40 to 18, so more than half. But also the number of fishing days that a vessel can operate has changed, have decreased from around 200 to less than 150. This trend has been gone in different phases, but at the end, the final trend we have in effort is that a sharp decrease on the fishing effort, that of course it comes with a sharp decrease on the landings of the catches that the fleet had. That the catches are low does not mean that the situation of the population is bad. Sometimes you read that in the newspaper, catches are every time lower, so that means that there is not fish at sea. Mainly that is not the reason. Maybe the reason is that you have decreased so much the effort that it's normal that this decrease. In fact, if you look at the relative, at the commercial yield, that is how many kilos a boat catches in one day, what we can find in Mallorca is there is a significant increase in trend. So that represents that the levels of conservation are high and you need less effort to obtain the same quantity of food to be provided to the market. So just as a summary of everything I have explained, the exploitation status of most of the demersal resources in the Balearic Islands are in sustainable levels. The impact of the bottom troll fleet in the area is currently limited, but exists, we know, but it's limited because we have seen the recovering trends, both in vulnerable species, but also in habitats. The important decrease in the fishing effort has led to a decrease of the catches, but we have just seen that the commercial yield of the commercial fleet has increased. And the issue is that the troll fishing effort keeps being reduced. The social and economic sustainability of the commercial fishery in general, the Balearic Islands, not only for bottom troll, but in general, are at risk. And we should not forget that reducing the local catches can trigger to a leakage effect. So that will represent an increasing of the import of fishing products from areas in which probably the gears and the fisheries are less regulated. So that increases the problems, and we can be exporting the problem of fishing to high-risk fishing in other parts of the planet. So here you can see the reference I cited, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bea, for this interesting talk. And now we have some time for questions. So
try to use the voice.
exactly.
Many thanks indeed for that talk. It was really interesting. And you painted a very optimistic picture of the changes. I wondered if you could go back 2 slides, because I missed that one. So I didn't see properly the green graph.
Yes, we have this here.
That interpretation. I couldn't see the increase of water effort.
Yeah.
But you also showed this data of the increase in rounding in Quetglas. The 150% and the increase of the other by 54%. But what was it starting from? Because the percentage increase can be misleading if you're starting from a very small base.
Yes, I mean, we started from the information we have from before the period in which I cannot tell you now the raw numbers. We can go, let me go back.
If you've got a very degraded system, which is improving, then you do get some dramatic improvement, but nonetheless it still remains very degraded.
Well, the situation here in the Balearic Island is that the level of effort has always been very low in comparison to other areas. And once it decided to be protected, this area, the situation was not catastrophic, I would say. I mean, you still could find important values of both, the biomass, what's at levels of, you were talking about the surface, the levels were of 650. You can see in the map in the bottom, the distribution maybe it's a bit small, but the colors represent the surface in the area. And the color part is the most recent one, but the lines represent the former one before the implementation of the plan. So practically, if this is the closet area, most of the part of in the area there were these habitats. So the issue of protecting this area was not only because we knew that in the past there were these habitats and they no longer exist. No, it was the opposite. In fact, it was coming from the implementation of EU regulation that forbid fishing over this type of habitats. So this habitat persists. The values in biomass were between 35 kilograms by 250 square meters and increased up to around 50. But the distribution was quite large. I mean, if you look at the total area in which it could potentially be present, the levels nowhere near zero. I mean, there were enough quantities that at that moment say, okay, there are these habitats here, there is this regulation that forbids fishing there, so we need to close this. And since then there was this recovery, which happened in less than 10 years. Because in fact, we have some previous study, very few years after the implementation, and in the first 3 years, we already could see some signals, but now after we have surveys before and after implementation of this, and now we have stronger data to calculate all these averages and so on.
Correct, Ivan?
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if you have updated the studies about the recreational fisheries, because I mean that was a part that remained in somehow hidden from the overall picture. And in the last years, in the last 20 years, but particularly I would say in the last 10 years, that has been a kind of an enormous, boom regarding recreational fisheries, which is also connected to sort of luxury tourism and all that. So that was just a question about this.
Yes, yes.
Well, part of the story.
In fact, we have not included, we are not, we don't, in our team, we don't study recreational fishing for a simpler reason is that they exploit species that are not the ones targeted by this type of gear. It's true that the relevance is very high, and when you are analyzing globally the numbers, that should be taken into consideration, but it's especially relevant for species that are caught by the artisanal fleet in this case, and in this case, it's relevant in order, for instance, in our case, in the stock assessment, we don't include that information because they are not, but it's true that there is a growing evidence and there is a growing importance in the different working groups to include that type of information for those species that are caught by recreational. But in this case, we have not included that here, but yes, for sure, it's a relevant thing to be considered in all the picture because it's also fishing, although it's private, it's not something like commercial.
I think Maurice.
The picture you painted about the less harm that is caused by bottom trawling is fascinating. No, that is contrary to what I know of what bottom trawls do in the global south, like in Cameroon, where I've been involved in research with local fishermen. And the government has passed a law that has banned bottom trawling altogether. So I'm really impressed with this contrary evidence from what I know. Apart from the decreasing fishing effort that you mentioned, what other things account for this success? Is it domestic regulation in Mallorca, or on mesh sizes, or on seasons, or just some more detail on what accounts for this? Because the data you painted about where bottom trawling is and where it is not, the difference is very minimal. In some cases, there will be more life, more species in those areas.
I think one of the key points that it's something I did not mention because the time was small is that in the Mediterranean in general, and in particular in the Balearic Island, the bottom trawling cannot be considered an industrial gear. We are not having here these large bottom trawlers. Our bottom trawlers are small vessels, maximum 20 meters, 22 meters. They are performing daily trips, so they come every day to the port. So the exploitation is quite controlled. The regulation is very strong, and it's true that historically the levels of exploitation has not been as high as in the mainland because of probably cultural reasons, because maybe the population was not that big in the past, maybe the level, I mean, in the 80s, there was an important peak of the number of vessels, but since then, for different reasons, including the price of the fuel, the number of vessels decreased. So I think that there are different aspects that deal to this. If we compare with the worldwide, one of the keys is that the fisheries here are semi-industrial, I would say, so you don't have such a big impact. And the other is that for any reason, the number of vessels has remained low, and probably having such a small fleet is more easy to do things. It's true that the regulations are not local ones in this case. We are having European regulation, national regulation, and in fact, in this case, it's a bit negative in the sense that although the stocks are in a sustainable exploitation status, the number of days keep decreasing in parallel of in other areas in which the situation is worse in the mainland. But I think it has been a combination of different things. There has been a lot of work carried out to, I mean, the issue that you mentioned of the measures, this exists, but this is a national European regulation, so it comes from other areas. But it's true that probably here, the controls in the past has been more strict. I mean, when in other areas, you could still see illegal fish in the market, here you could not see it. Maybe because this area is smaller, the number of vessels was smaller, it was so easily to detect who was doing things well or bad. But I think it's a combination of things.
I wonder, it's a very nice example, this one, and I wanted to ask if you think the lesson learned from the Balearic Island can be applied then to other, what would be the road forward for other examples, like in the peninsula or maybe in the Adriatic, where there's a lot of, because here the level was lower to start with. In other cases would be very difficult if it's a lot of bottom trawling to displace the fisheries. Like in this case, you mentioned that there's a loss of maybe jobs and there's just more import from outside.
Mm-hmm.
What would be a way forward for other examples?
Something that I think is key is that trying to operate at a small scale. I mean, sometimes all the management measures and everything comes to very wide scales, and the realities in each area are different. For instance, in the case of the mainland, the CSIC covers a big part of the mainland and has very peculiarities each port. Peculiarities meaning that the boats may be different, the type of habitats exploited may be different, so probably in each area, specificities should be needed. I mean, we are going more and more to this general management measure to apply to the entire Mediterranean on certain areas. But you need to look to the specificities and also look which are the needs of the population, both from exploiting and both for the market itself. I think it's also a question of, there is a very clear example currently in Spain, is that the number of fishing days are reduced, but it's reduced by boat. But there is no limit to changing to selling the boat from one port to another. So, for instance, here in the Balearic Islands, some boats have been sold to other ports because fishermen retired and things like that. So we have detected that in GSA1, for instance, the number of vessels have not decreased in the last years. In fact, it's increasing, which is against all the normal thing. But as the measures are taken at national level, the global picture shows a decrease. So this time of more focus a bit more on the specificities of that area should be key. And also one thing that I think is very relevant is that if you want to have a healthy fishery, both sustainable economically and also environmentally, is key to have the stocks in a good state. And for that, you need that the management measures are really applied. Because in many cases we have, I mean, I think that is no longer happening in many areas, but the issue is that the management measures should be clear for the fishermen. And I don't say that should be agreed with them, but they need to understand what that means. I mean, if they know that if you change the mesh of your coden, in the first year you are going to decrease the catches, but in 2 years they are going to increase. So this type of information is key to them for them to understand, and so it's easier for them to compile with the management measures that are enforced.
We have a question, Ife, and then we have another question online.
Of unsustainable fisheries from the EU to third countries. Because I feel that maybe some of the evidence you're presenting of reduced catch or things working is mainly because they are spotted as the EU common fisheries policies allow them to do. So I wonder the extent to which that is actually an accurate representation if we were having a holistic view of what is happening. Because essentially this is happening because Spanish vessels and other countries or entities from the European Union are able to export their unsustainable fisheries practices to West Africa. And we have so many examples, including Spanish vessels being implicated. So I guess it's not a comment, but I want to thank you for acknowledging that as part of your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you for the comments.
And online we have Antoni Gabriel with a question. I wanted to ask if elasmobranchs, a species whose growth shows signs of being affected, are equally affected by fisheries, but does it affect sharks and batoids equally? Presentation.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, of course not, and of course yes. I mean, in general, they are considered, no, I mean, the issues that we are talking about, many different species with their own growth strategies and own growth, everything. I mean, it depends of the type of biology of each species, and also it depends on the distribution in which they live, and also of the type of fishing exploitation in that distribution. If you have a species that is mainly distributed in areas in which the fishing effort is only affecting 2 parts of them, the global picture of the population, although the species could be more threatened or more vulnerable, maybe it's not that bad to another species who is fully distributed in an area with high levels of fishing effort. And this is combined with the type of species. I mean, batoids have certain characteristics, sharks and other ones, but we cannot generalize because we have shark species with have relatively short life species in comparison to other deep sea species with have very, very long life species. So there is no, for that I say yes and no, because there is not a total answer on that.
Thank you. And we have 2 more minutes if anybody else has more questions.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, te voy a preguntar en castellano. Si
vale.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Creo que vemos que los resultados más o menos son positivos, ¿no? Mi pregunta es, y mi reflexión sería, ¿cómo podríamos trasladar todos estos resultados a la opinión pública para dejar de demonizar al sector pesquero industrial balear? Porque vemos que, bueno, que las cosas se están haciendo bien y muy bien, que es más o menos es responsable. Entonces, ¿cuál creéis que sería la manera de poder dar, pues eso, la información a la opinión pública, que sea, bueno, que sea un poco más conversaciones del día a día, para eso, para dejar de que se deslegitimar al sector y que se sientan aupados por la sociedad?
Contesto en inglés mejor.
Sí.
The question was, how can we transmit this information to the people, because in general, bottom troll is demonized and so on. I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I'm a scientific, I'm a researcher, I'm not a communicator, but the feeling I have is that in general, there is a lot of misinformation about bottom trolling and in fisheries in general. I mean, I receive videos from friends who had seen something and they ask me about that because they see this and they ask me, is it true? And sometimes I see videos that say in bottom troll is catastrophic gear, and the images that you can see are not for bottom troll, they are for purseaners or other things. The issue is that we need good ways to communicate, and I think that the role of people involved in communication, not a role. But it's true that it's something that is complicated, because I had the feeling that people that are misinforming, they are not well informed either. They have not gone to the basis. There is something that say, okay, fishing is bad, but you know, the farmed salmon has worse efficient than controlling, and nobody's saying stop eating that. But I think the question is not for me, it's for how to communicate that. I mean, there should be ways to do that, but it's true that the other point is that historically it's a damaging art, and it's true that it's not. We are not saying it's fantastic, but if you do things right, you can make things compatible. And the issue is that we have an historic tradition of that things were not well done, and it's very difficult to change that for the population. But it's trying to keep informed people to how the situation is. For our side, it's the only thing we can do: publish paper, give conferences, and things like that. But it's true that I try to communicate that to my near environment, but it's true that the picture that we have is not this at all. Yeah.
Sí, sería interesante poder
Sí.
conectar, ¿no? La ciencia con
Sí.
la sociedad para ahora que vivimos en la era de la fake news de tal, pues estaría.
We have a last question by Dan.
Efficient than salmon farming, and you've defended fisheries as well for their greater efficiency. You haven't defined what you mean by efficient.
Okay.
What's it?
Sorry, no, I can tell you. Yeah, this. Yeah, no, finish.
No, so to say that salmon farming, not fishing, that it creates all sorts of problems in wild salmon. That's well known, but it's an efficiency question. What is the?
Yes, here it comes from a paper in which what they do was estimate the consumption of fuel. So in fact, they were calculating the emission of CO2, dioxide of carbon, to the atmosphere. And that was the comparison of how much they consume or how much are their emissions to the environment in comparison to that. I mean, there are many ways to estimate the efficiency of any production. And in this case, this comes, yeah, it's here. These are the kilos. The kilos you need, you produce by kilo of food that you are producing.
So it's efficient only in terms of CO2 output and not in terms of any other ecological difference.
This table it is. I mean, there are other studies doing different things because, yeah. Because you can study the impact on the environment as well, for instance, or you can study the impact on the yes, there are many things to compare, but in this comparison that it's what they, I mean, we go from the most efficient, which is corn, wheat, and rice, to the less efficient, which is beef, in using this scale, of course.
Impossible burger.
Sorry?
What's an impossible burger?
I think it's a company of.
It's mostly soy, the veggie burger.
Ah,
Yeah.
Yeah, that is like impossible.
Good point.
okay, so we are running out of time. Thank you, Rhea, and thank you all.